When it comes to companies building the future of mapping and monitoring the Earth, a lot of these companies require a large upfront amount of money, whether it's to build and launch satellites up in space, to make more images of the Earth, or even use those images that requires a lot of compute and storage. So, a lot of these companies in the industry of mapping and Earth observation end up being backed up by venture capital, raising up to hundreds of millions of dollars. These are the companies that end up in the news and do lead to enormous amounts of change. But not all these companies need to be structured that way. Today, I'm talking to Dan Pilone and Robert Cheetham. I've had actually Dan on the podcast before. He's one of the founders of Element 84, which recently acquired Azavea, founded by Robert. Now, this might seem like yet another story about one company acquiring another, and in many ways it is. But the biggest difference is that neither of those companies have taken outside investment. Azavea was started all the way back in 2000 and Element 84 in 2010, so both companies have been around for quite a while. That's what I wanted to focus on in this conversation with Dan and Robert. Acquisitions are really expensive. So how does a privately owned company buy another one? This is something we usually see VC-backed companies do, as they have a lot more upfront cash in hand. And then, why an acquisition now if both companies have been around for so long? Well, this is a conversation about satellite images, of course, but also about building businesses that stand the test of time. I really appreciated both Dan and Robert's candor in this conversation, both opening up to why they decided to go forth with an acquisition and how their motives are quite different. This is a conversation more about people than it really is about technology. A quick word before we start with this episode. I too am building this podcast with the goal of making it last and continues for years to come. I want to build this in a sustainable and durable way and would like to do so with your direct support as much as possible. That's why I have a Patreon where you can directly financially support the work that I do here on this podcast and allow me to continue researching and preparing these conversations. If you found these to be insightful and useful, I'd like to ask you to consider supporting my work on Patreon. I also share some behind the scenes there on how we prepare and edit these conversations to some of the new projects that I'm working on. Thank you sincerely to everyone who has been supporting me on Patreon, and that directly helps me continue to have these conversations and then share them all with you. I like starting these conversations the same way every single time. Dan, I'm sure you know you've been on before. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. So since Dan, you've been on, I actually ask Robert first. How Robert, would you describe yourself?
I am someone who enjoys helping people, and I also really enjoy learning new things over time. These are the things that motivate me, and I'm an introvert, but enjoy being around people. Not necessarily talking a lot, but having people around.
Dan, do you want to take a crack at it?
I'll start. This is probably going to set the theme for a lot of the rest of this discussion. I would consider myself largely an extrovert, but echo a lot of what Robert said. And I would say, in general, I'm an optimist. Everybody makes fun of me here about how hard could it be? That's kind of the space I live in. I'm pretty risk tolerant, and I tend to be competitive and curious. And when you combine those two, it's good and bad, but it means I'm interested, I'm curious about a ton of things. I tend to come at it from the how hard could this be, and optimistic they're going to be able to figure it out. So you put all that together, and it tends to make a lot of noise.
You guys have recently, gone through a whole acquisition. I like asking kind of the same question, but for the company as well. Because you both come from slightly different approaches, and so I'm curious, if you both had to describe what Element 84 is today, how would you do that?
Oh man, where do you want to start?
Take it wherever you want.
Okay, I'll start, but don't let me wander off. I want Robert to jump in here too. So where it is today, I think where we are today is not to cop out on this answer at all, I think we're defining that now. So I think that there's kind of a theory of culture and change, that there's kind of like freeze thaw moments, and major cultural pieces kind of get put in place when something forces a big change, and then they kind of settle down, they freeze, it kind of becomes a culture that executes for a while until there's another thaw moment that kind of triggers that. The acquisition, bringing all the folks over from Azavea, was one of those moments. And so we are still figuring out and identifying the pieces that really matter to us, and putting those in place, and getting the knowledge sharing, and getting everything together for how we approach those things. And I'm happy to talk about this, that there's a lot of lessons learned. I think one of the ones that I learned is, I think we had less formality around some things that were kind of passed down in almost an oral tradition at E84. And we kind of didn't notice those until a whole bunch of new people walked in the door, and we're like, okay, how do we do X? And it's like, well, go ask so-and-so, or whatever the case may be. And I think that was, so I think that we're now kind of sorting through and doing that knowledge sharing, that relationship building, all of those fundamental pieces that put it together. But I think ultimately we still care a lot. Obviously, we still care a lot about why we're doing this, where we're doing this, what direction we're going, all of those pieces. And it's more of a mechanics kind of a problem in terms of actually building the relationships and the dynamics and the knowledge sharing and writing down the things that need to get written down and all that stuff to make it smoother.
I want to get into those processes and like the more internal workings in a bit. I want to like kind of push again and like trying to say, how would you describe, from the outside looking in, what the company is doing today?
From that perspective, this is going to talk a little bit about this is going to start touching on why we did this, but E84 has always historically lived on kind of what we call the geospatial infrastructure side of things. We build scalable geospatial infrastructure systems. We do geospatial data processing. We support commercial satellite operations. We do open data, all of those pieces. We didn't have a great space. We wanted to get into more of the actual application of that data. That's really where kind of the rubber hits the road for us. Azavea did that. And so now together we can go end to end. We can go geospatial infrastructure all the way out to custom applications, applying that data, extracting information from it, and kind of making that data usable and applicable to a lot of domain problems that we really care about. That's where we live.
So it's kind of expanding the scope of tasks that fall under the umbrella of what you're touching on, from getting the imagery from a satellite all the way to solving someone's problem.
Yeah.
I want to go on the history a little bit as well, as to kind of how we got to where we are today. Mostly because, both Element 84 and Azavea have a pretty deep history. And from what I understood, they're quite different from where they came from. So Dan, we talked last time that I had you on, you talked quite a bit about the history of Element 84. So maybe could you give me a shorter version of the genesis of Element 84? And then Robert, I'd love to hear more about Azavea.
The super short version is, I was early on in an unrelated startup, or a different startup. Not a co-founder, but I was early on. We grew the company to 75 or so people. Loved it. Got acquired, got spun off, got reacquired, ultimately ending up in a hundreds of thousands person sized company at the end of that whole process. I really missed the culture. I missed the environment. I missed what we had as a smaller organization. And so talked with Tracy, my wife, our co-founder, and we decided to start Element 84. And only half kidding, we came at it with, we're either going to create the kind of place that we want to work, or we're going to have to suck it up and get grown-up jobs. And so we that was what we set out to do. We weren't trying to build an empire or anything like that. We wanted to create a place where we had good, kind, professional, smart people working together on problems that matter. And so we weren't going to be bigger than 5 people. And then, you meet 5 people that you like, and we're up to 10 people, and we get to those 10 people have people they want to pull in, and we're at 15 and 20, and 20 is completely unstable from a business perspective. So we're at 25, and then eventually we get to 50 some odd people. And along the way, we've built this place, that we call Element 84, but it's always hung around kind of the three values of, we're reliable, we invest in each other, and our work benefits our world. And everything we do kind of gets filtered through that lens, the lens of those three values, and shapes how we think about ourselves and where we're going forward. So.
Actually, it's quite a fun because a lot of the even terms that you use were the same ones that you used to describe it last time we talked about it. So I feel like you've told this story multiple times. Yeah, Robert, I'd love to know a little bit more. I was trying to piece together a story of like where you started. And I think I saw that you started in landscape architecture and Japanese studies. And so that to me is like, there's a story here. I want to know, how do you go from that to starting a software company in the early 2000s to a geospatial company today?
Yeah, one's life history often only looks like it makes sense in retrospect. But my undergraduate university degree was in Japanese language and literature, and I worked in local government in Japan for 3 years after school, and so lived in Japan for a few years. And while I was there, became really interested in how humans shape the landscape. In particular, a place that is both as rich historically and in terms of its ecology as Japan, and the ways in which human beings have shaped that landscape utterly. So I while I was there, formed this idea about studying landscape architecture, in particular taking an ecological approach to that. Applied to graduate schools from Japan, and got accepted a few places, and deferred another year to put in around 3 years, and then came back to the States to Philadelphia. Moved to Philadelphia. I grew up in the Midwest. My parents were immigrants. My father was somewhat entrepreneurial, but was also a minister. My mother was a nurse. But I grew up in the Midwest, so coming to Philadelphia was a little bit like coming to the city. And came here to study landscape architecture at Penn. About a year into that, it's a 3-year program for someone that doesn't have a design background. About a year into that, was not sure I wanted to do this. I decided to stick it out another year and see how it went. And a couple of key things happened. One was I took a class with a guy named Dana Tomlin. And so as you may know, a lot of the early work on GIS was done by landscape architects. There's some really interesting stories there around Harvard and students developing GIS tools in the graphics lab there. But there's a legacy of GIS in a number of landscape architecture departments, and the one at Penn was no different. They had a GIS analysis professor, this guy, Dana Tomlin. And the first semester of that second year, they had what they called a plenary session, in which we got 2 weeks with each of the 6 full-time faculty in the department. During those 2 weeks, they kind of went over their approach to their academic life, their research interests, and so on. So I had this 2 weeks with this guy, and I just fell in love with GIS. It was so interesting. Now, this will date me. The tools we were using were command line Idrisi from Clark Labs. There wasn't a desktop ArcGIS quite yet. So this is 1995 or so. And it was a raster-based approach to GIS, but it was really about thinking through geography and thinking through spatial data analysis. And I decided I want to keep pushing on this. So for the next year and a half, I took every class I could around. I audited a spatial statistics class. I took every class I could with Dana, and worked in the computer center and other things. So Coming out of school, the other event in school was I met a girl, and she was a landscape architect, and dated her for a while, and we didn't end up staying together, but I learned a ton from her, particularly about how landscape architects, like what they do every day. And I liked her, but I really realized I didn't think I wanted to be a landscape architect. So it's one of those things where you get this impression from like reading books about what a profession is like, and then you actually go to school and you're still really interested in it, and then you see the actual day-to-day practice and you're like, I'm not sure I want to do that. So I finished my degree. I became a landscape architect, but never practiced. My first job out of school was with the Philadelphia Police Department. So this is a pretty big, unusual shift for a landscape architect. But there were actually two of us who were hired, both landscape architects, to start a crime analysis and mapping unit. So police department wasn't doing mapping work of their crimes yet. They had really just started to develop a digital queryable record of crime incidents. And this was a little bit of a bet on the part of a chief inspector, a guy named Charlie Brennan. Chief inspector in Philadelphia would be kind of middle management in the police department. And he had this idea that crime mapping and data-driven accountability was going to become important. He was maybe one of the only people in the department that felt this way. None of his bosses thought this was interesting or useful. So kind of the whole organization didn't care. Now, you would think that taking a job that it wasn't a civil service job, it was like a grant-funded job. Taking a job in an organization that doesn't give a shit about you would not be like a really great thing. But in fact, it was really awesome. Because it meant that we weren't taking anyone's job. There was no legacy that we had to continue, and we could kind of invent what we were going to do. And the guy who did believe in this, Charlie, this chief inspector, gave us a simple mandate on the first day we joined. He said, I don't know what I want you to do, so you go figure things out and show me something interesting every couple weeks. So that could not be better for a young, curious person coming out of graduate school. Show me something interesting every couple weeks, and I'll give you some feedback, and then, go back and show me something else interesting in a couple weeks. It was magical. It enabled us to figure out how the organization worked and figure out where the data was. And we didn't even have software or desks or computers the first couple of weeks. So, but it gave us a lot of room to get our legs under us and figure things out. And then something that happened that we could not possibly have imagined or expected. About 6 months, something like that couldn't last forever. And about 6 months in, the mayor, who at the time was Ed Rendell, fired the police commissioner. And he brought a new police commissioner in. He knew who he wanted to hire when he fired the old one. The new guy, a guy named John Timoney, joined. He'd previously been the first deputy commissioner in New York City. And he had this idea around that he had pursued in New York, came under the term CompStat in New York. And but it really came down to data-driven accountability, using data and maps to hold individual police districts accountable for their work. And regularly getting together to review the data and talk about what's going on in that particular district. The assumption being, you get what you measure. You're gonna pay attention to the things that you're measuring, and having a discussion. Every district is going to be different. It's going to have different patterns to what's happening, and a lot of those patterns are going to be geospatial. So the next year and a half was just this wild ride, because suddenly we went from no one cares that we even exist to everyone cares that we exist, and we are the center of what the police commissioner wants to try to accomplish. Now, we are only a means to an end. What he wanted was accountability and communication. But we were going to be the mechanism he was going to use to get there. In New York, he'd had about 100 people that supported this effort. There were just the two of us and one other cop. So there was a huge premium on automating the heck out of everything. So I bought a bunch of books and sat down and taught myself how to write web software, and taught myself, kind of retaught myself programming. I'd been interested in computing and programming when I was in high school, but just kind of reteaching myself for the web. Taught myself relational databases and Oracle and Linux and Windows administration, kinds of other things. And we automated everything we could, and built probably one of the first web-based crime mapping systems, and be able to push these maps and data out to the districts. Essentially, to scale ourselves without hiring a lot of people. And I walked away from this with two what I felt like were really powerful experiences. One was this high pressure learning opportunity, the chance to learn rapidly under a great deal of expectation for what can be accomplished with a very small group of people. And then the second thing was something that, this guy's approach worked. The reason the police commissioner had been fired by the mayor was in almost every city in the United States, both violent and property crime was in a pretty steep decline through the early 1990s. And Philadelphia was a major exception. Nothing had changed. And this guy brought in a different approach. It was really a demonstration of how leadership can change culture and change expectations and change how an organization operates. Crime started to fall in Philadelphia, and pretty quickly. My friends would come to me and they're like, my neighborhood feels safer than it did 6 months ago. And I'm not sure what this guy is doing, but it's really working. And there were some downsides to it, to his approach, but by and large, it had a pretty big impact on public safety in Philadelphia. Now, we weren't the cause of that. We were just a means to an end, but I felt part of something larger, and I love that feeling. When I woke up in the morning, I did not wonder, why am I doing this? I felt like I am doing this thing that is making my community better. And that was a really powerful, compelling feeling. I hadn't felt like that in my job in Japan or in other jobs in the past. And so those two things, like doing meaningful work and high pressure learning. But I had a lot of student loans. This job didn't pay very well, and there were no real prospects for advancement. It did eventually convert to a civil service job, and it became a permanent part of the police department's organizational structure. But I decided to leave because I wanted more. I wanted to pay down my student loans. I was already thinking about starting a business. So I took a job with the city of Philadelphia as a software developer now, because I had some developer skills, and doubled my pay. I was able to pay down my student loans, get together some savings, worked there for a couple of years, and then struck out on my own. And it really was just a consulting business. I had about $15,000 in savings. I couldn't pay myself for about the first 6 months, just kind of lived off those savings. And then things gradually grew from there. But those two experiences at the police department became the key components of of Azavea's mission, to advance the state of the art in terms of what can be done with geospatial technology, and then apply that for civic, social, and environmental impact. Do meaningful work and invent new things along the way.
What prompted you to start a business? Because it seemed like you were a part of a team, and that was a really important part of what you enjoyed is being a part of that group that had meaningful work. If you start, especially on the contracting thing, I have a sense it might be a little bit harder to find that sense of being a part of a team and maybe on the meaningful. So why decide to start something rather than join somewhere else?
It's a great question. I think some of it is just ignorance, like a sense that some of it was frustration. Like I didn't see a future growth path for a place like the police department. Working for the city, I had a great team around me, but it was a much more frustrating environment. Real tolerance for sort of incrementalism. I was learning somewhat, but I was mostly learning on my own, though I wasn't learning a lot through the work that I was doing. And while you could kind of connect it to something meaningful, it was a bit of a stretch. I mean, it was public service, and that is has its own kind of meaning, but a lot of what you do is attend meetings and have discussions about things, and then you might go and do something, but it's hard to draw a straight line from there to helping people, making people's lives better. So I wanted more of that, and I wanted more self-directed. So in some respect, at a basic level, I wanted more control. I wanted to be able to find my own meaning in the work that I was doing and have more control over it and guide my own learning, I suppose.
So you start taking on, you said at first contracting jobs?
Yeah, I was a consultant, and I was ignorant. Like I have no business background. I took an accounting class in university, but that's about the extent of it. I'd been a manager of a McDonald's when I was in high school and college. So that was about the extent of my business training. I didn't know anything about marketing. I didn't know anything. Like the first scope of work I had to write, I just was like scraping the barrel. I didn't really know what I was doing. But I kind of understood. And in fact, early when I was thinking about what to do, I struggled with whether I wanted to start a nonprofit organization or a for-profit organization. And clearly I was aiming to do something for the public good. And that like conceptually lines up with a nonprofit organization. But I didn't know anything about how nonprofit organizations ran. Like I'd never worked in one other than a university. But I kind of understood that like you do some work. I'd done some consulting work while I worked at the police department as well, and as well as in graduate school. So I kind of understood like you do some work and then you get paid for that work, and that's a business. That was about the extent of my business understanding. But even like starting a new business is a huge learning experience. There's so much you've got to learn about. You've got to learn about payroll and taxes and laws and reading contracts, and then you've also got to do the work, which I found very rewarding. I love writing software. I love programming. I love solving problems. The stickier, the better. Love trying to figure out like how to make the limited tools you have do things that other people may not have imagined before, and that was the real thrill of it.
When Dan, you mentioned earlier, like you started a company with like 5 people, like it seemed like there was a vision for like having people already. And Robert, what you're telling me here is it's just you for now. How do we get to it's not you anymore?
I was able to finally pay myself a very modest salary, $3,000 a month, about 6 months in. So this is August 2001. By the following spring, 2002, I had enough business that I couldn't do it all. So I hired a summer intern. And he was a bit like me. He wanted to learn programming, and he enjoyed GIS, and he was a smart guy. And so I got an office. I rented an office space. his name is Blake Esselstyn. We've stayed in touch. Does a lot of work in redistricting and continues in the GIS space. But he will remember well. We had no air conditioning, and that summer was particularly hot, and we just like sweated out the summer together in this small office space. But that was kind of an easy decision because he clearly could not stay on past August because he was going back to school. The harder decision was to hire the first full-time person. And I would say, like, starting a business was not the major life decision. In retrospect, it was hiring the first full-time person. And now suddenly what I felt was a great deal of responsibility for that person's life, their salary, their well-being, and so on. And looking back, like, that was probably the most important, like, life diverting thing, because now you're not making decisions for yourself. You're making decisions for others, and the more of those people there are, the more you have to feel that.
And Dan, I can see you're nodding your head along a lot. I feel like you've probably gone through a lot of the same things.
Yeah, I mean, that weight of having, okay, so like the easiest way to put this, when we do our health insurance forms each year, there's a question on there which is I think it's phrased as number of souls or something along those lines, and it's like it's yeah, I absolutely sympathetic with Robert here. That sense of bringing somebody in, that sense of obligation, that you initially it was, here's what I want to do with the company, and I don't mean I personally, like somebody starting companies, like, okay, here's why we're creating a company, here's what we're going to do, and you have to hang on to that, while at the same time you now have other individuals, right? Like, decisions that you make, risks you take, affect more than just the people who signed up to start the company. And so, Tracy and I could make decisions in the beginning that largely, consequences fell on us exclusively. And then as you pick up additional people, people have lives, right? They have children, they have mortgages they're paying, they have, and all of that. It's a big deal. It's wonderful. It's great to be able to create that. And I feel like I'm talking a little bit out of both sides of my mouth, because that's part of what we set out to create, was a place for that people wanted to work. But the gravity of that is real.
Yeah, I can imagine. I want to keep rolling the clock a little bit back, Robert, on kind of the early history of Azavea. I also kind of just looking up at first, I saw that you were mostly working with, I think, Microsoft and Esri at first, like working on these more desktop GIS tools. How do we get to Azavea as a company that, well, part of Element 84 today, but like develops a lot of open source tools? And so it seems like there's quite a shift in culture there and in what the company does.
Yeah, that is certainly true. We started out as an Esri business partner and used pretty much exclusively Esri software. We were also a Microsoft business partner, and a lot of our early work was built in C# using the .NET framework. For folks who are familiar with that, we were almost entirely building web applications, though. We did very little desktop work early on, a little bit, but mostly just around managing data, getting it ready for use in a web application. I knew that I wanted to focus on building web apps primarily. I think a lot of the shifts over time, what I think, going back to that mission around like inventing new things, learning from the process and applying it for public good, like that's the mission of the organization. And that was embodied in a lot of the values that I later tried to articulate: focus on learning and growth, default to transparency, share what you learn with others, and so on. That created an environment in which I'm very grateful that people felt like there was the openness to suggest new ideas. And one of those early ideas from, I think he was employee number 4, was to he had been reading about, his name was Steve Meyer, he'd been reading about Google's 20% time program. This is like maybe 2003, which they allowed their engineers to spend, a day a week on personal engineering projects. And he said, we should do something like that. And I'm like, well, we're a bootstrap company. Like, we don't have a lot of capital. Let's make it a 10% time program. It's not a bad thing to be, so it's putting some of our time in any given week into learning new things, sharpening the saw, trying out new stuff, investing in new ideas. So that 10% time program that he suggested carried all the way through Azavea's history, and it served us in a whole slew of really interesting ways. I mean, I cannot tell you how many changes, new ideas, new directions came out of that type of thing, either 10% time or other like learning opportunities for people, new product ideas. And one of those was open source. A guy said, I'd like to spend my 10% time on exploring open source tools. I was I don't know, frankly, I was pretty skeptical. I'm like, I don't know, you think that stuff's ready for prime time? This is maybe 2004, 2005. And he said, I don't know, but I want to try and figure it out. So
Okay, let me interrupt you. What are you skeptical about? Is it like the business model, or what is the skepticism about?
That the technology was ready to be used in production applications.
Right. So the open source tools, like alternatives to some of the Esri Microsoft tooling that you were using.
Yeah, it's not clear what the support is. Are they mature enough to like deploy in production to use for, actual client problems and so on. But
right,
I was
so we're
also
just talking about using it, not developing open source software.
Oh yeah, we're talking about using open source here, not developing new open source. Absolutely.
Okay.
That was not yet something we were exploring at all.
Okay.
So he put together a 10% time proposal in which he was going to build an application. We were going to use one of our clients' data to build what we call a culture browser. It was going to be a mobile app that would look at a bunch of different data about Philadelphia, historic photos, murals, and all sorts of things. And he was going to try out map server, GeoServer, PostGIS, and turn this into an application that did something. So he put about 6 months of 10% time into this and came back with an app that it worked. And his conclusion was, look, Robert, I don't think this stuff's ready for prime time, but it's getting close. Like some components of this really, really work. And I think it's something we should keep an eye on. And so over the next few years, that's what we did. As we hired more developers, it became a tool we could use, part of our tool build. That grew from there into scenarios in which it really using open source tools made the most sense, and more developers who joined us who said, I prefer this. So shifting from the default sort of being the .NET framework and C# and Esri to let's pick the tool that's best for the client in this particular scenario, and developers saying, if it's all the same, all things being equal, like I prefer to use this. I just I have more control over how I work and so on. So it was a pretty gradual evolution. But over time, we also had suggestions from staff about we were experimenting with building products, and in some cases, colleagues were saying, what would it look like if we open sourced this instead of trying to sell it? So that became an active point of conversation, and eventually those are the sorts of steps we started to take. Some of that happened in conjunction with better source control tools that made it easier to share code. I think our earliest open source tools, were just kind of downloadable zip files. There wasn't a lot of like public source control in the way that we think of today with GitHub. And it was a very gradual evolution. But by the time we got to like 2010, we had made a pretty big shift in terms of the technology we were using. We were still building on top of Esri tooling because a lot of customers use the Esri ecosystem. It's just really a critical part of like how a lot of organizations operate, and we weren't looking to change that. We weren't particularly like open source ideologues, but pragmatically, it was easier for our folks to work and build successful applications. And so wiring up tooling to an Esri API or wiring up tooling to some other API just kind of became more of a question of pragmatics, like what is the organization using and how can we make their investment in that technology successful. The other change that came about through 10% time experimentation was adopting AWS. We were very early experimental users with the first releases of AWS, and Amazon Web Services it felt very strange early on, but we had people who were pretty excited about it, experimented with it, and came to the conclusion, this is like really great stuff, and I think it's the direction we should go. And so that's gradually where we went. And by 5 years later, you're suddenly not deploying anything in a client's infrastructure anymore. There's nothing more on premise. So by 10 years ago, we were almost exclusively using open source tooling to build applications, almost exclusively using AWS, and almost no on-premise deployment anymore.
This is hinting at something that I'm very curious to have both of your takes on, is building companies that have a longevity to them. We hear a lot about companies that are the hottest new thing right now, and then 5 years later they're just a shell of themselves, or they don't exist anymore. Azavea is 23 years old, and Element 84 is, I think, 12 or 13, something, if I got those numbers right. Like, that's a long time for a company, especially Bootstrap, to still be around. I'm really curious if you have any ideas as to why the companies like manage to succeed like this over the long term, not just right now, because especially in this technical world, things changed a lot. So just talking about, open source becomes a thing, cloud compute becomes a thing. Like, these are all things that can kill a company if you miss the mark. Not to mention 2008, a huge economical crisis where if you have a bootstrap company, it's maybe harder to make it through harder times. So this is a broader question, and I'm curious for both of you to hear your answers as to what does it take for a company like this to succeed over the long term.
I think it's a great question, and I think a lot of it is, for me, I'll speak for me here. This is kind of, what are you trying to build? Are you trying to build a company that does this thing right now and goes after that? Or are you trying to deliberately build something longer lasting, something that has its own legs under it? We sat down and we wrestled for a long time early on, trying to figure out, what's our vision, what's our mission, kind of how do we capture this? And we at our company offsites each year, we would put up a slide with like, okay, here it is. And then 12 months later, we had drifted from that, and not like in some like fundamentally broken way, but just evolved. And so that's what pushed us back to saying, okay, you know what, like, this is going to change. This is going to change every year, like you said, particularly in this space. Like, everything changes around us the whole time, and everything feels like it's constantly accelerating. So we settled back on coming at it from a values perspective. We settled on we invest in each other, we're reliable, our work benefits our world. And then from that, we can use that to inform decisions as we go. For me, there's a it's funny, like all the things we've talked about so far kind of tie together for this to answer this question. That pressure of, we have, 100 people here kind of a thing, that I feel kind of breathing down my neck at any given time. You pick your thing, the technology evolving, the new technologies coming out, competitors, things that are getting commoditized. And Robert can talk about this a good bit of, you kind of have, kind of two fundamental options here of either make it cheaper or make it better kind of options. And for me, that our goal, if really our goal is to benefit the world, you look at what are users trying to do and how close can we get them to actually doing that? They have some big audacious thing that they're trying to get to, the companies that we work with. And so what are they trying to do? How close can we get them to do that? And every year, if we ask ourselves that every year, I'm not saying every year, every 6 months, whatever the right frequency is, that should continually shift to the right. We should be able to do more. We should be able to push the envelope a little bit more. We should be able to help them accomplish more with less every single time. And so if we're really good about being honest with ourselves of saying, okay, there's a better way to do this now, whether it's open source or whatever, there's a pragmatic way to achieve this. This has been commoditized. We need to move and help the users push further. Whether you do that because you're curious about the thing and you're excited about the thing and you're driving it, or you're scared of being swallowed by that commoditization wave that's chasing you, they both push you kind of in that same direction. And if I'm being truthful, I feel both of those. I'm excited about, now we could do this thing. And at the same time, I'm like, and if we don't do it, we're going to get eaten by this wave. So both are a factor for me. And so when you have people that are excited, that are passionate about what they do, it's a lot of kind of just getting out of the way a little bit and kind of just making sure that we're executing in a way that's sustainable. But just keep forward looking. We got to keep forward looking, and we've got to do it in a healthy, sustainable way that lets us keep doing it.
Yeah, I didn't start Azavea with a timeline in mind. I've never been very exit focused. In other words, building an organization in order to sell it or have some exit. Dan and I are both part of an organization called the Tugboat Institute. It's a group of privately held companies that seek to both operate people-first, purpose-driven organizations and do so for the long term. So, I mean, I didn't articulate it this way when I started, or even 10 years in, but over time, I've come to feel like an organization, if it's fulfilling the needs of customers, a business organization should be able to operate indefinitely. And doing so for the 100-year timeline is a lot more interesting, challenging for sure, but a lot more interesting than doing so for the year or 2-year timeline. And while we think of technology businesses as being venture capital funded, the vast majority of business organizations are not. Most organizations are bootstrapped. Your average local restaurant or whatever, and probably most technology businesses, frankly, are probably bootstrap businesses. The ones we see in the news are venture funded, and they get a lot of attention because of that. And they have investor funds that they can use to attract that kind of attention. But it's pretty normal to be bootstrapped from my perspective. I never wanted the part of why I was going into business was greater control over my destiny. And if I strap my destiny to a bunch of investors, like I lose a certain type of control. I was spending their money, and they correspondingly have a great deal to say about the destiny of the organization, how it's run, and so on. That doesn't mean you don't go through financial trials. As you suggested, like, the 2008 crisis was one, and both LME4 and Azavea have had our series of financial challenges over the course of our history is how you navigate those challenges. Sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you make good decisions, and they are challenges that can trip up the survival of the organization. But I don't think it's coincidence that a lot of organizations get founded during recessions. A lot of businesses get founded during recessions, and Azavea was no different. I mentioned that I struck it on my own in spring 2001, paid myself my first salary in August 2001, and then 9/11 happened 30 days later. And then that was kind of the beginning of the dot-com crash, and then there was a recession after that. And I don't know, we just kind of grew through it. Like, it didn't really affect us at that time. We did get hit with the 2008, 2009 financial crash. I guess this might have been just before Element 84 got started, but we didn't get hit as the crash happened. We had a lot of government customers, and it really affected them about a year later. So when they're doing their fiscal year budgeting in 2009, as well as when they started having trouble. And we had a few months where our biggest customers just didn't pay us. So we were profitable, we were doing good business, and the city of Philadelphia simply said, you know what, we're not going to pay you for now. They were in a tax distribution dispute with the state of Pennsylvania. And so they just stopped paying their vendors, knowing that we would start calling up our representatives and yammering to settle this tax dispute. And it almost broke the business. Like, on paper, we were profitable, but we didn't have any new cash coming in. We only had a couple months of savings, and at the time, we didn't have a line of credit. So what do? You're conservative. I didn't want to let anyone go. I'd never let anyone go for financial reasons. So my wife and I ended up cashing out our savings in order to make payroll at October. And we got lucky. The city settled its dispute with the state and then paid all its vendors again. And then we were kind of back in cash flow positive territory. And I took that crisis and that stress and went out and got a line of credit. Since I had a bunch of money in the bank, got a line of credit so that never happened again. We've had other crises since then. As you get bigger, things can have big impacts fast. So we had a crisis in 2018 in which we lost a bunch of contracts all at once through no fault of ours. It's changing priorities, or the organizations we were working with decided to cancel the initiative, and it were clustered in just like 60 days time period. And so suddenly we had way more people than we needed. So we had to weather that crisis. Now we had a line of credit, and we set aside some money, and we'd also invested in some products. And so I decided to sell one of those products, and that helped us make ends meet over the next several months, and we were able to, again, avoid having to let anyone go. So those things happen, and they affect bootstrap organizations perhaps in some respects more, though, again, you're sort of the master of your own destiny. You have more levers to pull on your own than you would if investors controlled the organization.
Yeah, the money's probably just bigger for investors, and it's someone else's money, but it's still simple math. One of the things I noted that you both brought up was kind of the idea of the impact and doing things like in the values that you mentioned, and for the company, I think like there's doing good work, if I picked that up correctly. And Robert, you've talked multiple times about wanting to help people. I think you mentioned in a previous conversation that Azavea was, maybe still is, I don't know if Element 84 is, a B-corp. And so those seem like there's a difference between saying, okay, we're going to do some good, and don't be evil, to quote Google's previous values, and like the actions of the company. Like, the intentions are good, but then there's putting systems in place to making sure that happens. And being a B Corp company, at least from what I know, seems like one of those ways to build incentives and structures in place for companies to do, quote unquote, good. Could you talk a little bit about why you decided to do that and maybe what that entails in a bit more detail?
For Azavea, Azavea is no longer a B corporation, and unfortunately, that B corporation status does not transfer to LM84. So, if LM84 at some point in the future decides to become a B corporation, we'll have to go through the process again. But for Azavea, it was we actually didn't do much. I had decided to join a local business organization called the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia, SBN. And there's a bunch of these around the United States, local business organizations that focus on sustainability and mission and social impact. At that time, when I joined, the executive director said, we require all new members to take the B Corporation assessment. You don't have to become a B Corporation, but we require you to take the assessment. I later learned she never enforced that, but I'm kind of a rule follower, and so she told me I had to take this test. I got to take this test. So I did. I stayed up late one night and did the B Corporation assessment. This is pretty early days. We were not a founding B Corporation, but this is 2009, I think, and without doing anything, we scored a high enough score to become certified. But I kind of didn't get the benefit. We were already operating the way we were. At the time, their membership structure had you essentially paying a percentage of your revenue as a membership fee. It felt sort of like a tithe, and I wasn't quite sure what the benefit was going to be. And so I decided, no, we're not going to do that. So we qualified to be certified, but I decided we. However, at the time, we were in a trademark dispute. So Azavea didn't start as Azavea. Azavea actually started as Avencia. And Avencia was original name. I really like the name. We got a registered trademark from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. But a few years after we got the trademark, someone came and disputed it. And quite frankly, they were bigger than us and had a lot more money. And it got to federal district court. And we were still pretty small business. And our attorney gave her assessment, which was, you're going to win, but you can't afford to win. You have to give up. The attorney costs of doing this are just going to be too high. I'm like, shit, I guess we gotta fold. So we actually kept the rights to the name, but we agreement required us to change our name. So we changed our name, decided we were going to do this around December 2009, and we were going to roll it out March 1st, 2010. And we were almost 10 years into the business at this point. And I had felt like, while internally we had a very clear mission, we had rarely articulated to the outside world that we were a mission purpose-driven company, and that's how we made all of our decisions. And so somewhat as a marketing tactic, I further went back to that B Corporation assessment, and I went back to B Labs, who does the certifications, and said, hey, I might have changed my mind. Would it be possible to become a B Corporation after all? And they said, sure, yeah, you can use your old assessment. It's been less than a year. And I said, but don't tell anyone until March 1st. So we wanted to roll out becoming a B Corporation with a new website, new name, and essentially a re-articulation of who we were in a much more public way. And I saw the B Corporation status as essentially this kind of marketing tactic to encapsulate that. Same people, new name, re-articulation of what we were about and who we were. That worked pretty well. In retrospect, though, it was probably the wrong reasons to become a B Corporation. At least in the years since then, I can't point to a single client who like signed a contract because we were a B corporation. A few maybe found us because of that, but it's not the kind of thing that makes the difference between a decision to buy or not buy our services. It probably did have some sort of marginal marketing value, but the biggest difference, and it was revolutionary, the biggest difference was to existing staff and prospective colleagues. When they saw that on our website that we were a B corporation, and over time what we learned to do was like, this is the first thing we say when we talk about who we are. Like, we are a B corporation and here is our mission. And it became the first slide in every talk. It became the first thing we said when we described the organization in a bio or something. That had an enormous impact on who we attracted and as potential colleagues, in the structure of like what questions people asked in interviews, in a whole range of different things. And it changed the culture by changing who wanted to work for us and I think generally a really positive way. And I think people at Azavea were quite proud of the fact we were a B corporation. They liked telling other people. And as the B corporation brand became better known over the following decade, I think that impact has only increased. So yeah, I would say for us, we changed nothing to get the status, the certification. It's a lot like a fair trade certification. It doesn't.
Yeah, actually, could you define it? I feel like we haven't done that. Like, could you define like what it is in maybe simple terms?
So the B stands for benefit, and they're essentially for-profit companies that operate for and for the sake of a broader set of stakeholders than just profit. So corporate law, at least in the United States, requires that a for-profit company operate for the sake of its shareholders, for the good of the shareholders. And essentially that means operating for the sake of profit. And if you don't do so legally, yeah. If you don't do so, your shareholders can sue you. So you must operate for the sake of the fiduciary benefit of the shareholders. Now, if you're a bootstrap company and there's only, like me and my wife are the only shareholders, so we're not going to sue each other, hopefully. But but if you have external investors, they can bring a lawsuit against you if you fail to operate for the fiduciary benefit of the shareholders. And so the B corporation concept is, in some respects, it's an old idea. A company that operates for the sake of a broader community. It could be its customers, it could be its community that it lives in, the physical location community, it could be its employees, as well as pursuing profit. And so I think that's the one common thread. Now, B Corporation certification is really an assessment of how you actually operate across several axes: governance, employee, how you treat your employees, how you pay them, what benefits you provide, how you relate to your community, how you relate to your mission, the degree to which your mission is embedded in your business model. And you get scored based on this. And the scoring system is such that if you get over a score of 80, then you can be certified. And being certified means you become part of this broader community. You pay an annual fee to maintain that certification, and then you have to get recertified because they every 2 or 3 years. I think it's currently it used to be every 3 years. It's now every 2 years. That recertification is a significant ongoing challenge because they keep raising the bar. Like the goalpost keeps getting moved out.
Just like the tech.
Yeah. So and it's a significant, it became a significant administrative burden. That first time I did the assessment, we were a small business. I did it in 5 or 6 hours in a long evening. The next one, it took me a few days. And the next one, it took me a couple of weeks. And so on. So you have to get recertified. Now, there's another concept that, confusingly, B Labs has advocated for over a long period of time as part of their legal advocacy work, their legislative advocacy work. And that is to create a legal structure called a benefit corporation in the statutes that would give you, becoming a certified B corporation gives you no legal cover. This would give you legal cover if you operate a business for the sake of a broader set of stakeholders rather than just the shareholders, essentially protecting a business operator from their shareholders if they decide to make decisions that are based on non-fiduciary factors. So if you make a decision to not take a customer because of its environmental impact, for example, you turn someone down, or you decide to distribute your profits that year as bonuses to your employees, and you've got investors, they can't come back to you if you define part of your purpose as operating for the sake of your employees. So that benefit corporation statute exists in the United States now in about 36 or 38 states, something like that. And it's an option. You're still a for-profit company. You sort of elect this. And today there are far more benefit corporations in the United States than there are certified B corporations. The certified B corporation status is quite a bit higher bar.
Okay, cool. That's a really good context for just also how companies work in the US, and I'm actually not sure if it's the same across the world.
The B Corp organization, B Lab, exists in Europe now, and as well as South America and other parts of the world. And I think that statutory, they've tried to add that statutory component in each place they've expanded to.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about the legal requirement to maximize profit for shareholders. Like, I don't know if that is something that's broader as well outside the United States. I don't know.
Yeah, it is. I think it is. I think it has taken hold in the United States to a much greater extent. Milton Friedman and others who have influenced corporate culture in a way since probably the 60s to focus on this. But it's been built up through court precedent and other mechanisms to become quite a limitation in terms of how you operate.
So now let me ask you, why merge the two companies? I want to get back to that. That's why we're here originally. It seems like we have, visions for companies that are operating in the same industry, but have also a long history that, at least from the outside looking in, look pretty stable. You guys are on just your trajectories. What's the rationale for deciding to merge the two companies? Like, Dan, you talked about it at the beginning of it. It allows to address a wider array of just the whole pipeline of processing satellite images, but that could have been done still as separate companies. So why go forth with an acquisition?
I can kind of kick it off from our side, which got the conversation going, and then Robert can talk to why he went along with this crazy idea. So from our side, actually, the last time we talked on this podcast, we had talked about kind of growth and that we didn't grow for growth's sake. We grew when there was a reason to, when we felt like there was something we were trying to do and we couldn't, and that necessitated growth to get there. Last time we talked about career progression and not having people career out of the company and providing new opportunities and being able to have a bigger impact, and all of those were drivers that we were used to. From our side, from pre-acquisition, we think about all of this kind of geospatial space that we live in kind of along a spectrum. And so on the left side, we have like data providers, the groups, whether commercial or open data or whatever, but putting sensors in space and providing data. Moving into geospatial infrastructure that allows the management, processing, use of that data. Keep going to the right, you get to kind of data analysis, analysis-ready data, the ability to use that data, et cetera. And then you move even further to the right and you start to get to what we talk about as geospatial applications. And then that's kind of where for the most part, users live, right? That's where this stuff gets applied to meaningful things in the world. Pre-acquisition, we lived pretty solidly on the, left 2/3, maybe left half of that description that I'm talking about along that spectrum. We had built up a lot of, if you talk to Aravind, will talk about the boring parts of geospatial, right? Like we dealt with a lot of the boring parts of geospatial. We built solutions for that, open source and everything else, and we were kind of living there. I really, really wanted us to be able to get closer to end users. I really wanted us to be able to apply this, petabytes of data that we were moving around and organizing and dealing with. We wanted to make it easier to use. We wanted to be able to work with those folks. And frankly, I felt stuck. I felt like, and I'm saying this is kind of the leadership team within the company, but the E84, we felt stuck. Things like machine learning were a really important tool to be able to bring to bear on this kind of data. The scale, the volume of the data, the scale of the data, we needed to be able to do that. User experience was a critical component of this. And I'm using the term user experience depending on who you talk to, like the accessibility, the way to present that, to extract information out of that data, present it to people that answers the question, understand the questions they're trying to deal with, they understand the space that they're operating in, understand their domain and their problems, and then to be able to marry that up to information extracted from geospatial and remote sensing data and surface it in a way they can use it. That was a critical piece of it too. And we were out of capacity on what we had internally. We were saturated there. And we were really bumping up against, for maybe a year, of really trying to build out some of this stuff ourselves. You hire a machine, like there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. Like, do you go get something where we need to develop a custom machine learning model and then hope we can find the right people to do it? Do we hire people that can do it and hope we can find a project that will then support that, or projects that support them? So we were really kind of in this space. And I felt like, as you get bigger, kind of you have these like step function increases, but the steps get bigger. And Robert mentioned earlier Tugboat Institute. So we were both at, I jokingly call it CEO summer camp, but we were both there together and we got talking about this. And I felt stuck. And I had this conversation with him that I felt like we needed a step function for E84. We needed to be able to move in a bigger jump than just hire a machine learning person or hire a UX person or try to build these things out. And I had, we had all known about Azavea for a long time. Huge fans. They're incredibly well respected in the space and really driving a lot of the things, and really complemented E84 in a lot of ways. Like, they were consuming a lot of the data that we were surfacing and producing these geospatial applications and producing these machine learning models and tooling and open source tooling around machine, GeoTrails and raster vision, groundwork, all of this kind of open source tooling, that anything we were going to build was going to need to rely on those pieces. And so that kind of got the conversation going, from a technical level, looking at the tooling, on a personal level, being able to talk to Robert and, with his CEO hat on, and I feel like we're stuck here. We need a bigger jump. And that kind of kicked off the conversation. But we spent like the next 18 months figuring out how to actually get from there to here. So that's, from my perspective, that's the E84 side of what kicked this off.
Yeah. And I think Dan and I are, we're probably about 10 years apart in terms of age, and so ended up having different motivations. Like, what for me, like why join E84 was driven by a bunch of a confluence of a bunch of different events. There are really good business logic reasons to do so, and Dan's done a good job of articulating those. But there were also a number of personal ones for me. About 9 years ago now, I was diagnosed with cancer and went through treatment, surgery, and radiation and whatnot, and fortunately, came out the other side and in good health. But it drove there's nothing like getting really sick and then getting treated for it and recovering to remind you of your mortality on a regular basis. And so it drove me a lot of it at my wife's behest to think about succession planning. So while that was in my mid 40s, and you don't really think you need to write a succession plan in your mid 40s. But my wife was pretty insistent. Like she was like, I don't want to run this business, and you need to like think about what happens if you get sick again, or heaven forbid you have an accident or whatever. Like there needs to be a plan. So I wrote a succession plan. Now it wasn't a succession plan that was like, here's what's going to happen. It named a designated successor. It's what kind of in case of emergency break glass succession plan. Here's where all of the things are that you need to know. There's a designated person, there's a backup. And here are all the options you would have in terms of figuring out what to do with the organization. But several years pass, and I am in my 50s now, and I had a growing sense, less pressure from my wife this time, but a growing sense that I needed to start to think about succession planning in a more realistic way. Like, what would ownership of the organization look like as I got older? And to not, I had seen other entrepreneurs who got into their 60s and then got stuck. Like they weren't sure how to proceed, and health started to drive decisions that may not have been in the best interest of the organization. So I had made a commitment publicly to my colleagues that I was going to explore diversifying ownership of the organization. And I did this about, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, just before the year before the pandemic. And I started doing so. I looked at a lot of different options. ESOP, which is a U.S. tax scheme for employee stock ownership. Like you sell the organization to an employee-owned retirement plan. Newer ideas like perpetual purpose trusts that turn the organization into being owned by a nonprofit that encapsulates the company's mission. Selling to investors, selling to employees in a more piecemeal way. And I talked to a range of different people, didn't really have a plan though, but had a really good sense of what the various options would be. Merging with someone. The one thing I didn't want to do was I didn't want to sell to private equity. I felt like that would be really bad for employees and customers. And that's the most common out for an organization like ours. So then the pandemic happens, and the first year of the pandemic for us, it was galvanizing. People really rallied around these new conditions. We lost some contracts in the early days of the pandemic, but we also gained some. We won some COVID response work with the World Bank and other places. And people really rallied around the flag in some respects. That lasted for about 6 months. And 2020 was our best year ever, highest revenue, most profitable, handed out the biggest bonus pool ever at the end of the year. But toward the end of that year, we started losing people, and a trickle of departures. And often people have been with us a long time. Dan cited this idea of, like, Azavea has been much the same way. We've never wanted to grow for growth's sake. We wanted to grow because we had the business to support growth, and as a path for colleagues to grow into new leadership roles and take on new challenges. And our growth had stalled. And many of our people had been with us a long time, 8, 10, 12 years. And we started losing those people one or two at a time. And it was pretty devastating emotionally, for me anyway, losing colleagues. And I mean, they were going on to great things. You don't want to begrudge someone a chance to, double their salary. And now, because of COVID, we're all working from home. We don't see each other. Colleagues aren't able to, see their friends, have lunch together, build things together in the office. We were mostly an in-person company here in Philadelphia, had a few remote people, but not a lot. And all of that's gone away. And the emotional ties that bind an organization together, I think really were weakened. In addition, you have all these big West Coast companies with infinite money that now no longer expect you to move to San Francisco or Seattle. And I don't blame my colleagues. Like, they got amazing offers to go work for Microsoft and Amazon and really cool satellite startups and all sorts of things. But for Azavea, it was really hard. Like, we suddenly went from being profitable and growing to having a hard time hiring. We all remember these were like, it was also hard to find new people. So if you lost someone, it's going to be a lot. You're going to have to work a lot harder and wait a lot longer to get the next good person. And it started to get hard to service customers. Like, we were just barely hanging on. And we went from being profitable and growing to barely hanging on, being break even, to not being profitable, losing money because we couldn't hire, turning down business because we didn't have enough people. And that went on for about 18 months. We finally turned the corner summer last year, 2022, on hiring. We got back to the point where we were fully staffed. But through all of this, I was frankly just miserable. It was exhausting. We couldn't pay attention to growing the business, to inventing new things. We weren't in person anymore. I said at the beginning, while I'm an introvert, I really like being around people. I love the ideas bouncing off each other. I love like going out for beers or going to lunch together and like chatting about new things. That's where a lot of, I think, innovation and invention can come from, these kind of casual interactions. I felt like we were becoming less innovative, more defensive, and less able to take risks on bold new things. So I stopped. Dan's experienced the same thing probably. Like, I would get calls or emails at least on a weekly basis from potential buyers and investors, just like nonstop for years. And I just said no. Early on, I would take the calls and I'd listen to them, but pretty much wasn't interested. But I stopped saying no about a year and a half ago. And that coincided with Dan and I talking a little bit, but it also coincided with some other folks approaching me. And last summer, ended up having conversations with 4 different organizations. And by the fall, had narrowed that down to a couple. And then in November, made a decision to sign an agreement with Element 84. And the way these things go for like, this may look like a merger because we're 2 organizations about the same size kind of coming together. Mechanically, it's an acquisition. Element 84 is acquiring Azavea as a business. And so you go through a few months of due diligence process, and we had that from November to February. And then at the conclusion of that, if things still look like they make sense, then you tie the knot.
So I do want to ask, how does a bootstrap company acquire another one, like financially? Because again, this is I'm really curious, like the why. Like, appreciate both of you talking about why, and those are very different reasons. But then on the mechanics of how that works, usually it's, as you mentioned on the culture side earlier on, it's usually a bigger company that acquires a smaller one and then kind of swallows it. The culture propagates to the smaller one. Here it looks like, I think Element 84 was maybe a bit bigger in terms of headcounts than Azavea, but not by orders of magnitude. And so in terms of capital as well, acquisitions are something that are quite expensive. So I'm just really curious if you could, at least touch on a little bit how that went forward. How does a bootstrap company can afford to do that, basically?
Yeah, we can't talk about the specific details of the arrangement or the financial side, but we can kind of talk about it at a higher level. So first of all, I kind of mentioned earlier when we were talking about, moving forward and making sure we're doing it, like how do you build for the long term, and making sure we do it sustainably. And this is where like I have to recognize, or it's important that we recognize kind of Tracy's role in all of this. We joke that like I'm the balloon, she's the string.
So your wife, which is also co-founder.
Yes, my co-founder, president of Element 84. Yeah, like we have kind of we fill two different roles in E84, and I am very risk tolerant. Like I mentioned earlier, kind of, how hard could it be? And her job is to come back and say, let me tell you how hard it's going to be. And like, I mean, she has an MBA, like that's the side of the world that she lives on. And she makes sure that, at the end of the day, this is going to work, that we're putting together something that's sustainable, responsible, et cetera. She's more naturally risk averse than I am. I am more risk tolerant. The safe space is probably somewhere in between the two of us, but basically by that tension between the two of us, it kind of lets me lean a little further and she can pull me back in. So from the beginning of E84, we have been very, like Robert mentioned earlier with Azavea, like we never took outside money. It was always E84 dollars that we were working on. And we talked about kind of the gravity of having people work here, et cetera. So in the beginning of the company, we actually had full cash reserves for the entire company to lose all of its work for 6 months, and we could ride that out kind of a scenario. You reach a certain size where that just doesn't make any sense anymore, and you need to like reinvest that money back inside the company and enable us to do kind of, Robert mentioned kind of our internal R&D and stuff like that. So you stop doing that at some point, but we've always had cash reserves available to us. So that's a dimension of it. And because there is, I mean, even in the best of circumstances with everything, it's not a cheap process mechanically. Like Robert mentioned, the due diligence pieces and, the attorney and attorneys and teams of attorneys and accountants and everything else. Like there's a real execution cost attached to all of this, regardless of the deal itself. So financially, we were in a position to be able to absorb that. That came out of savings. That's just that all that money came out of pulling from there. After that, it really takes, kind of like-minded organizations. Like in our case, if it's a big company acquiring a small company, or like you mentioned, orders of magnitude, then it's a little different. If you're acquiring a 5-person company, that's different. Something of the scale of Element 84 and Azavea took kind of, really, I'll say creative, and I don't mean that in a flippant way. I mean it in a sincere way of like, okay, how can we make this work for both groups? How do we align incentives? How do we make sure that, the success of the resultant organization translates into success for everybody? And the growth there fits. I can't say enough good things about working with Robert and the whole Azavea leadership team when we did this, because if I came out of this with nothing else, like I've learned to appreciate how much things could go off the rails with different people involved, different culture, and the cash on hand gave us the flexibility to be able to execute this, and then having the right company to work with, the right people to work with, kind of the right cultures gives you the flexibility to kind of work around different options and be creative in a good way to figure out how to kind of financially navigate through this. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're acquiring a smaller company, it's easier. The dollar values aren't the same. But when it's a bigger organization, there's a real cost to execute it, and then there's the whole how do you align incentives and organize things together. So yeah, I think that's really the crux of your answer is, or the crux of your question was kind of how does a smaller company pull something like this off? And from our side, that's really where having the business side being aligned with and supporting the technical side is absolutely critical. We couldn't have done this without having that kind of support, and being able to explore options and pull in the right groups around how do we actually structure something like this to make it work.
And so what's the future looking for Element 84? And let me maybe narrow that down a little bit at first, and then you guys can open it up. Now, because like, again, the companies were about both same sides, it kind of feels like there could be two cooks in the kitchen. So how is just the company moving forward, but also, decision making and leadership as a whole?
Yeah. So I can talk to some of that. And then obviously, Robert, welcome your input here too. So first, again, I really have to kind of recognize the personality pieces of this, the human pieces of this. Like Robert's been really helpful in terms of avoiding kind of the too many cooks in the kitchen kind of a scenario, and we can work together on these things. The leadership team came over and we merged those together. It meant shifting some roles around, but our combined leadership team really reflects both of them. A lesson learned where I feel like we got something wrong, or all in this, where I feel like I got something wrong here, is my personality, and I think Element 84 culture is obviously the best case scenario is to be decisive and right. That's what everybody wants to happen. What I appreciate better in retrospect now than I did before was I think it is better, at least for us, to be decisive and wrong than to be indecisive. And culturally, inside of E84, we've always been comfortable making mistakes. We talk about this internally. If we're not making mistakes, we're not trying hard enough, we're not pushing hard enough. We just want to make new and creative and exciting mistakes. We just don't want to make the same mistake over and over again. And I think pulling the companies together, we lost sight of that a little bit. I think it would have been better off to be, particularly since they were comparable in size, I think it would have been better to be decisive, ultimately wrong, be comfortable with making a mistake and getting it wrong, and just regrouping as an organization and saying, okay, that was not the right call. Now what do we do? Let's take the additional information we have now and let's do it. Let's do something different and let's fix the decision we made wrong. I think we as a collective organization spent too much time kind of being indecisive, or kind of just seeing how, and again, maybe I should own this more personally than saying as an organization, but being indecisive, and not just committing and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we'll reevaluate it in 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, whatever the right interval is. And if it's the wrong decision, it's the wrong decision. We regroup. But setting that aside, like a concrete example of kind of where things are going and what we can do. I just gave a talk last week at the AWS DC Summit in DC, and I got the privilege to present work that a team had done that was a combined team of folks that came over with the acquisition and people who had been here before. And I gave a talk, or I gave a presentation and behind the scenes, like a chalk talk, explaining how everything worked, of near real time drone data processing for disaster response. And this combined a little bit of everything. It combined the disaster response experience that we had. It combined the larger scale data processing. It combined developing custom machine learning models. It combined optical machine learning models. It combined user experience for how do you surface this and identify the actual problem and solve the problem. And all of this gets deployed on like an embedded, like a snow cone, the AWS snow cone, a portable device. That kind of project we could not have done without that combined team. And that is like, I was so excited to be able to present that. And like, that's it. Like that's what we're trying to get at. That was all of those pieces coming together that we couldn't do. And so getting people working together, getting the shared leadership team working together, building the personal relationships, and then having like, this is exactly the kind of thing we wanted to put together. And it was a standing room only talk that I got to give, and it was like, yes, this is it. This is what we're trying to get to. So I think that answers your question, but that's kind of the direction things are going.
Yeah, and I would say part of what has contributed to not having a feeling of too many cooks in the kitchen is I think we had pretty complementary executive teams that had complementary skill sets that, like, there were folks at Azavea that filled in gaps at Element 84 and vice versa. And I don't think we've had a lot of personality clashes at that level. I would also say that for my own part, like, part of what was motivating me to do this is I didn't want to be the CEO anymore.
Right.
And I didn't have a successor internally. And I will say that like, in complete candor, like, the day I signed those papers, this huge notional weight just came off my shoulders. And so I feel a great deal of gratitude for the opportunity to feel like a lighter human being. That being said, another motivation for growth, as we both said, in terms of like how our philosophy around why we grow the organization, is to create new opportunities and enable new capabilities. And I remain excited, motivated, and inspired by what we can pull off together. My goal in all of this, other than not being CEO anymore, I optimized for kind of three things. And these three things really haven't changed over the couple of years where I was thinking about this. One was my colleagues will have jobs that will be meaningful and challenging. Two, our customers will be taken care of. And three, like, whoever we join forces with, whether it's an investor or other people, will be aligned in terms of mission and values. And like, if you take those three things as your basic requirements, it narrows the scope of like who you could work with to begin with. And in terms of purpose, the nature of the work, being willing to, take on all of our clients, there just aren't many organizations that could come as close to alignment as Element 84 and Azavea. So I feel grateful to be an employee and have a boss right now. And a year or two may pass and I may be a recovered CEO, but I'm not a recovered CEO yet. I'm in recovery, and I eventually may come to feel differently. But right now, I feel pretty great about supporting another organization rather than being the person in the pilot seat with all the pressure.
I appreciate that. I think we keep hearing about just growth in terms of companies, in terms of career, in terms of everything. It always has to go up and to the right. And I think like this is also really interesting because there's these two different like people. Like, Dan, you seem so excited about like where things are, like compounding and growing, and Robert, it's a pretty different approach. And yeah, I really appreciate that because it's refreshing to hear that, and I appreciate the candor that you both are bringing to the conversation as well.
I will add that I feel a strong desire to go up and to the right, but not in terms of like size and finances per se, but rather in terms of impact. And the pressure I continue to feel and the motivation that I continue to feel very strongly is a sense of a great deal of urgency around climate change, resilience, biodiversity, and a sense that we unfortunately live in a critical time in which these are very urgent issues, and a larger organization will enable us to take on bigger challenges related to this. So Azavea had made a deliberate decision several years ago now to focus a lot of our proactive business development and new work on climate, water, and sustainability. And the fact that that aligned with a lot of folks at Element 84 and where they want to go is not a small part of this. But I think Dan and Tracy and the rest of the executive team share this sense of, and many of our colleagues share this sense of like now there's no more critical time than now, and the now demands a particular kind of challenge, and a larger organization will have more capacity to scale.
Let me
Yeah.
sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to totally agree with Robert. Like I don't feel the pressure to grow right now. Like we've done that step that we needed to do. The pressure I feel right now is and kind of the like pent up probably with what's coming through in terms of sounding like excitement is like I'm so excited to get back to work. Like we spent a long time getting to February when the actual deal closed. The change is hard for everybody on both sides, and kind of establishing a new norm and building relationships and building trust and everything else. And I know the capacity in the company. I know the potential. I know the expertise now that has just expanded in all different directions. And everybody is just chomping at the bit to be able to get like, all right, let's bring this to bear. And I can't wait to do that. And, Robert mentioned kind of the whole executive team's kind of in that boat. Tracy's background's in civil engineering. And so she has had, since the beginning of this company, the idea of like, we'll be able to get pieces in place that then look at sustainable development and, sustainable cities and sustainable planning and things along those lines. And so now to have a broader set of skill sets and just talented individuals and more just raw capacity inside the company to do it. It's so nice to be able to kind of like shift our focus back to why we're all doing this and settle down some of the mechanics of how to pull it off.
I wanted to, respond to that sense of urgency that you were talking about, Robert, because earlier in the conversation, we also talked about this notion of, having long-term thinking. I think you mentioned even like 100 years, like this is really long term. We're talking like decades, like really long term. And it seems like you both are in this for the long term. It's not trying to do right now. And here we're talking about urgency for the specific problems, of climate change and things like that. How do you bring those two things together of thinking about long term but acting on problems that have a sense of urgency?
I can speak a little bit from my own perspective, but I'd also defer to Dan because I'm sure he has his own ideas. I think thinking about the long term shapes like big picture decisions. At Azavea, I think that was, what is the character and nature of the projects we are going to take on and we are not going to take on? So that may mean a decision today. Are we going to pursue this bid or not? Or are we going to respond positively to this inquiry from a potential customer? But in doing so, you're really thinking about what's the organization you want to have 2 to 5 years from now, because as a professional services organization, who you hire determines who you will become and who you'll be in aggregate. Who you take on as a customer is going to shape who you are and what it's going to feel like to be there. And so, I mean, I think Dan had a little bit different experience, but I, like, from the time I wrote down our mission, took me a few years to get to the point where I actually wrote it down. But from the time I wrote it down, it really didn't change it at all. It was the same thing. I think I tweaked word order or something a couple of times, but it was pretty stable over time. And that mission shaped who we decided to take on or not, shaped our project selection guidelines. Like, we had a written document that shaped who we were going to work with and who we weren't going to work with and under what circumstances. It shaped the values that then shape who we hire, because it's the long term is really an aggregate of thousands of small near term decisions, and your values and mission or purpose are in aggregate over 10 years or 20 years shaped by those daily, weekly, monthly decisions. So having that like framework to work from, not just for myself personally, but for an organization, like, enables you to have that long-term thing. And then there are other things, like we're not beholden to investors. So we don't, I mean, we We may report metrics monthly and quarterly, but we can say things like, well, we didn't make money this month. Okay, here's how we're going to make money next month or next quarter. Or, we're not going to make money this year. You don't really want that, but here's like how we're not going to lay anyone off, and here's how we're going to get through this. Or something like COVID happens, and here's how we're going to respond. We're thinking about this for the long term. We're going to think about where we want to be a year from now. We're not going to make a knee-jerk decision about how to respond to this. Here's what we're going to value. Here's how we're going to try to make sure people feel supported and comfortable. So all of those things go into the, like, I'm not, 100 years is a nice number because it's beyond any of our lifetimes. Well, at least, unless we're very lucky. So beyond my own lifetime, but generationally, like, where do we want to end up and what kind of organization do we want to be is in aggregate all the thousands of daily decisions.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Robert said. In my head, I've got 3 buckets that I look to. And again, I'm saying I here, but this is, E84, how we think about this culturally as a leadership team. So first, we need to have a sustainable business. It needs, at the end of the day, we have to be able to pay salaries. We have to structure things in a way that's responsible and works. And, with, like we were talking about earlier, with cash on hand, that gives us internal flexibility to make our own decisions. To Robert's point about, we're not beholden to investors. We're not beholden to external. Like we're really internally, where do we want to reinvest and where do we spend money, and having that available to us gives us the ability to do that. So we have to have a sustainable business. We have to have a healthy culture. We have to trust each other. We have to be able to have conversations. We have to be able to disagree in a healthy, professional way, and know that it's okay to disagree. And I think we are stronger when there's a diversity of opinion, when there's disagreement over things, but you can have those conversations because I think ultimately you end up with a better solution at the other end. So we've got to maintain a healthy culture. And then those 2 things then kind of create the environment or the fertile soil for a curiosity and a humility about the problems that are out there. Like we're talking about kind of the urgent problems around climate change, and pick your piece of that. There's just so many issues there, but that's just like one slice that we're looking at right now. We had the opportunity a couple of years ago to do some work in the omics space, proteomics, genomic data, things along those lines. And stepping back from a technical perspective, those problems look a whole lot like the geospatial earth science remote sensing problems looked a decade or 2 ago, somewhere in there. Like it's massive amounts of data, the ability to discover that data, to share that data, to operate on it at scale. It's all accelerating. It kind of has all the flavors of the geospatial problems. And I think geospatial has advanced in a lot of ways from an infrastructure perspective that just now is beginning to kind of happen on the omics side of the world. But it's a whole different domain. Like there's a whole different set of expertise you need to develop there. We had the opportunity to work in that space for a while, and that was absolutely awesome. I just ate it up, and talking with just some amazing people that are doing literally curing cancer. I don't know if I talked about this the last time we met, but like they're literally curing cancer, and they're like, oh, but here's the process I have to go through to kind of move this data around. It's like, oh my gosh, we could make your life so much better and accelerate that whole space. So for me, yes, there's an urgency with the set of problems we have here, and we've got great people working on those. And so basically, if I know we have a sustainable business, we've got a healthy culture where we can debate things and disagree and come out the other side stronger for it, then that gives us space, looking at that 100-year horizon to say, okay, like where else the humility of saying, I don't understand how this thing even works. Help us understand it. And then kind of balanced with a belief that we can make an impact on it. Like, okay, what can we bring to bear to make those things, to improve that space? So, to me, there's always a sense of urgency, if that makes sense. Like there's, if something looks like it's solved, it's like, oh, no problem. I can just look over here and find a whole other mess that we can hopefully get involved in and really just move the needle on something. So, it's having those three things all in the right balance, is what lets me think about, all right, how do you put together a 100-year company? I also agree with Robert. I'm not going to be here in 100 years. So there's, what's the path to get to there, but for someone else to figure out.
Do you see that as I think the genomics we talked about, because that's what Element 84 was doing in the early days, if I recall correctly, like more on the computing side of things, and then it slowly went towards the geospatial. Do you see like coming back, especially after the acquisition, where it seems like that's doubling down on the geospatial side of things? Or do you see like it's still possible to stay nimble and apply the services side as well of the expertise that you got from Azavea to an entirely different applied field, but where the tools might be the same?
Yeah, I very much want it to. I want to be real careful. I don't want to like send mixed messages like we're a geospatial firm, this is what we're doing. But I want us to be able to, as we've grown now, I think we have phenomenal skill sets that we could bring to bear on a lot of different kinds of problems. So really COVID hitting took a lot of the momentum out of work we were doing in the health and genomic space, because money shifted over to COVID work. And so a lot of kind of the other pieces that were happening slowed down for the time. We have not really circled back, but I would argue, and Robert, I'm curious, we hadn't talked about this, but I'm curious what your take on this is. We had discussions literally last week around things like harmful algae blooms and looking at toxicity and the ability to kind of detect those and react to those from using remote sensing data and the application of like hyperspectral data. That feels like we're starting to bump into, again, kind of the health side of things. Now we're coming at it from a geospatial dimension, but there's a whole lot of additional work. So, right, in this case, you would take and potentially do, genomic sequencing on an algae sample, right? Like we're starting to bleed a little bit into that space again. And right now I don't want to distract. I want to get us solid and running on a nice rhythm again and kind of integrating everybody and all the different capabilities we have in the geospatial space. But yes, I can't wait to have the capacity to be able to dip our toe back into that space and kind of cross back in there, because I think there's a lot of, the machine learning expertise, the UX expertise, the dealing with data at scale, cloud expertise, all of these things, discoverability of data, all of that, those problems transfer. And I can't wait to get back into that domain again. Robert, I don't know if you see it similarly or not.
I would say the companies do have different history in this perspective. Azavea has pretty much from the start been explicitly and unapologetically focused on geospatial. Nonetheless, over time, we've found lots of situations in which what we are building in terms of technology for geospatial applications has other applications, or applications we build don't have a map in them, even though behind the scenes there's a lot of geospatial processing. It's a place-based set of decisions that are being supported. And so I have a fairly flexible view on that. As recently as 2 or 3 years ago, this was just before the pandemic, but ran through it, we had a clinical trials firm come to us. And interestingly, this company had been using remote sensing software from ERDAS to process images. They're focused on gastroenterology, so these are images from colonoscopies and endoscopies. They were using remote sensing software to process these images because it worked. And so they thought nothing of talking to us about how we could apply our satellite imagery tools in a web and more scalable cloud environment and architecting their clinical trial system using geospatial tools. And so we ended up doing that work over the next 2 or 3 years. Their challenge was the desktop ERDAS software wouldn't scale as their digital imagery and video operation was growing exponentially. So we helped them architect a cloud-based infrastructure that processed images. Those images happened to be slices of people's colonoscopies, but it seemed legit, and we were applying our geospatial experience and knowledge to this, and they're still processing TIFFs with the header just happens to be different than a GeoTIFF. So I don't think we're proactively seeking that kind of thing out. I do believe that the types of sensing capabilities that we are getting from drones and from the rapid exponential growth in satellite sensors, as we add new imaging capabilities, whether that's synthetic aperture radar or hyperspectral imagery, it's going to enable us to ask new questions, whether it's about forestry or public health or water. I think all of those things have a geospatial component to them, but you end up having to build a kind of expertise in these related areas. Azavea over time developed deep expertise around stormwater and stormwater runoff models and around climate models, and more recently around working with hyperspectral imagery and forestry. That's an awesome part of running a professional services business. You end up interacting with and exposed to whole new swaths of human knowledge and experience, and you have to absorb a lot of that kind of on the fly, and that's it's a big attraction of this kind of work, is the sheer diversity of it and how it changes over time as priorities change.
I want to kind of go into predicting the future a little bit. This is just very exploratory, but I think it's usually an interesting exercise. You guys talked about, I forgot who brought it up, but this idea of there's basically two types of work. There's making it cheaper or making it easier. And so either on the remote sensing, on the medical side, health side, I'm really curious, like, what do you think that some of the work that's going to happen at Element 84 or in the industry is going to be about in the next 5-10 years? Is it going to be making things cheaper? Is it going to be making them easier? Is it going to be something completely different?
I would actually push back a little bit on your summary. I would say there's, when you think about strategy for a business organization or a nonprofit for that matter, there's two basic branches of how you're going to structure the strategic thrust of an organization. One is cheaper, faster, better. So you're optimizing something, you're reducing the cost, you're trying to figure out how to make the inputs more efficient, you're trying to reduce resources and so on. The other is create something new that's different from anything that's come before. Now, most organizations can't do both of those things. You need to pick a lane. And my bias for Azavea was always do something different, do something new. Don't compete on price. Don't compete on faster. Eventually, that's a race to the bottom on price. It's highly competitive. You can pull it off for a while, but it eventually, like, your competitive advantage erodes as other people enter and reduce the price further. But it's totally legit pathway for business growth. The other is do something different. Now, that risk of doing something different is what is different, particularly in the technology world, is constantly eroding. What Dan described as a sort of commoditization process. You're constantly building on a foundation of sand. So the challenge from an organizational structure perspective is how do you enable the organization to learn fast enough that you and have the willingness to like essentially jettison things you were doing to like leap to the next thing forward. To me, that's much more exciting and more interesting. And I don't want to compete on price. I want to compete on price, speed, that sort of thing. I want to compete on, we're going to invent something that you didn't realize you needed, or we're going to create a capability that we weren't even sure how to, like, was that possible when we started? Or we're going to try and anticipate like what's missing that the world needs, that would make things, it could be just a marginal difference, but over time, improves things. That to me is a more interesting, exciting, challenging, and that's the space I want to be in.
What do you think that might be now or in the next few years then?
I'm sure my perspective will be totally different from Dan's, but the things I'm excited about are these new Earth observation phenomenologies, about which some of them are quite old, but that I don't think we've plumbed the depths of what's possible with them. They even scratch the surface. So for me, like synthetic aperture radar is fascinating. It is largely the province of defense and intelligence right now, but there's so much like undiscovered avenues for applying it for other purposes. We're about to launch a whole series of constellations of hyperspectral satellites that will provide much more continuous coverage of the Earth with a much bigger hyperspectral. You've got lots of small bands covering a big block of the spectrum. We know it's going to be useful in lots of new ways. We don't really know all the ways it will be, and figuring that out, I think in the coming years, it's going to be a many years process. Machine learning is going to help us get there, and I think that's going to be extremely exciting. I think like the degree to which we can apply generative AI, not necessarily ChatGPT-esque, like large language models per se, but the degree to which we can apply that approach to machine learning, to interpreting the avalanche of imagery and other sensing information, and make it more understandable for humans and more actionable is super exciting, interesting, challenging, hard. And I think in many respects, figuring out how to adapt our governance and collaboration structures, both within organizations and between organizations and across governments, local, state, national, to respond to what I think are gonna become existential challenges. These are going to be like huge opportunities for possibility, for prosperity and thriving, but also enormous risks that we're going to be grappling with. It feels like in some cases a curse, sort of there's a Chinese curse of may you live in interesting times. We live in interesting times. Oh my goodness, it's both frightening and galvanizing.
Dan, I'm curious to hear your answer to the same question.
Yeah, so actually, I think Robert and I are probably more aligned than maybe he was worried about at the beginning. But I think there's, starting back with kind of the different business models. I'm in complete agreement. Like we're in complete agreement here that we don't live on the commoditization side of this. We're not driving. How do we drive these costs, because that requires a scale. The whole point of that is you can do things at scale, and it requires a scale that's just not really what we're structured for. It's not the nature of our services business, right? Because you almost deliberately want to kind of get the people out of it to help drive the costs down. I agree with Robert in terms of how we think about things. We kind of articulate them a little differently, but in my head, you kind of have this like bell curve of the adoption of something, and on the far one end of it, you're bleeding edge. You're not sure if the thing's even gonna work, and then progressively as it matures, at some point it it then shifts over to no longer be the new thing, and it kind of becomes commoditized, and a cloud provider offers it as just a click here to do it kind of a thing. They have a newest service is available, and it's dirt cheap because it can be done at a scale that can't be done by a services company like that, and so on. So our job, like our existential responsibility, is to do our best to kind of figure out what the next curve or curves are going to be and move over to them at the right time and incorporate it. Put a little more, flippantly, I think of it as like we can bring superpowers to our customers, right? So what's the next superpower that they could use, that they need, that they want, that would let them do something? And can we figure out what that is? And then how do we package it and deliver it to them in a way that it's new and exciting, and it gives them a superpower that they didn't have before. And then at some point, everybody gets it, and it's no longer a superpower, right? The whole industry just levels up, and you got to do that again. So, but getting more specific about it, I'm real interested in the implications of machine learning on software development. I'm not in the camp of like software developers are going to go extinct. I'm not coming at it from that perspective, but I think the integration of machine learning, and Robert mentioned generative AI, like some flavor of that. I do think can accelerate the whole software development space. Like, so anybody who's done, like, the whole history of software development is you do something once, you do it twice, 3 times, you find like, okay, this is stupid. Let's make this a library. Let's share it. Everybody gets to use it. Let's move on to something new, right? Like, if you can accelerate that process, that time from here's the thing I want to do to, can I just leverage this function, whatever, to be able to do it, the faster, the more you can accelerate that, the faster software development can move. And so I'm real excited to see how much kind of routine, boring stuff can we leverage ML to get out of software development and just accelerate it to how close can you get to, like, I have an idea and I can sit down and express it really fast and build something off of that. So I think that's going to have an impact. Totally agree with Robert on the more modalities around remote sensing. So, we have SAR. I agree. There's so much more to exploit out of SAR. Hyperspectral, it's not like new, but it's kind of I think just getting warmed up on what can happen with hyperspectral and being able to deal with data of that scale. The other thing, kind of the other flavor of that, with more sensors up there, you meant, tasking is kind of a thing that we can talk about if you want, if we have time. But I had a conversation with Eddie Pickle of Crunchy Data not that long ago, and we were talking about stuff, and I talking about global coverage, and he says, who cares about global coverage? He says the government cares about global coverage, and aliens can care about global coverage. Everybody else cares about local coverage. And I think he was dead on. And I think the idea of super high resolution, whether it's hyperspectral or optical or SAR or whatever, and the ability to task it and get and collect over a hyper local area, I think we're just scratching the surface of the implications of that. And I think there's tons of neat stuff to do there, and be able to bring multiple modalities over a hyper local area and extract information from it, which then brings you back to machine learning and things like that, basically accelerating the production of information out of just raw collected data. So I think if you basically all of this in my head turns into like speeding things up, and then we start talking about pushing compute to orbit, right? Like, so hardware is outpacing bandwidth and downlinking and things like that. You've got sensors that are flying that can capture faster than they can store it or downlink it. So like the duty cycle looks a lot smaller than it theoretically could be. So if you can move more of the compute up there, well, now you're basically moving information extraction closer to the data at higher band rate, a higher, I'll say bit rate. That's not quite the right word I want, but like you're able to extract information you're able to collect raw data faster, extract information, and then make that available and potentially do it in a hyper local way. So you've got accelerated software development, you've got additional modalities, you potentially are looking at the ability to extract information faster from that. Like, everything just gets faster. So what happens now when we can just turn everything up to 11 with more information and extracting more data faster? Like, how do you surface that? How do you apply that? How do people incorporate it? How do you integrate it with policy decisions and actual responses to crises or identification of them and stuff like that? Like I think there's all of this. I think there's just a ton there. And then frankly, there's a business model question for our side. Like, what does it look like when everything gets faster? And projects by necessity get shorter because we can just do it faster. How do we incorporate that in a business perspective, business sense? Anyway, that's my soapbox of like, these are the things I think are coming, and it's exciting, a little scary, but
No, I like it. It's a lot of echoes to what we talked about when you were on last time. It was like, it keeps getting faster. And it's like,
everything keeps getting faster. Or maybe I'm just getting older. I don't know. But I think everything just keeps getting faster.
No, but it's cool. It's exciting.
Yeah, I would add a few more things that I are like my take on the forecast. So we talked about, and Dan also talked about technology, but I think there's also other, like how we organize ourselves, types of challenges and invention and innovation that's going to be required as a consequence of a lot of these technical changes. I think, for example, how do we construct new frameworks for digital public goods that balance the interests of the public with the interests of the private individual? In the geospatial realm, we've had a couple of significant models. One, something like OpenStreetMap, sort of available to everyone no matter what. And we've had completely proprietary models like Google Maps, where the terms and conditions of using this are entirely controlled by a private commercial organization. Both have a kind of success and power, but I think they occupy two poles of a spectrum, and there's enormous opportunity to figure out new intellectual property regimes that lie between those two poles. Things that are quasi-public, but are like balance the interests of different kinds of organizations. One organization that I'm excited about is called Place. It was started a few years ago, and they're experimenting with a club goods approach. The idea with it, they're trying to balance the collection of geospatial data, often in low-income countries that have been, in which a commercial relationship would largely probably be exploitative. So trying to balance the rights of those low-income countries and communities against the desire by commercial organizations to have access to that data. So an idea where you may have a paid membership structure in which there's this club that has access to the goods under certain kinds of arrangements or under certain kinds of conditions, and at the same time complete access and ownership of those underlying goods by, let's say, a country in Africa or the Caribbean, the two areas they're focusing on. Anyway, I think that's one example, and there's invention required to figure out what does the governance of that thing look like? How does it balance the profit incentives that might drive invention and scale against the nonprofit need to limit access to the goods? How are we going to balance the public's interests and the public needs and privacy and intellectual property with things like generative AI? What are the governance structures we're going to need? Not just government regulation, but how organizations are organized. What are the legal structures that underpin them? And what I think we're going to have to be inventing new organizations. I'm excited about what OpenAI is doing, not just for the technical invention that they're leading, but the organizational invention of, we're going to limit our profits. We're going to have a nonprofit that controls the organization. We're going to accept investment, but only under these circumstances. I think there's going to be tremendously interesting opportunities for innovation and invention in that area. And geospatial is going to be going to be a really important field on which that needs to play out.
So not just on the technical innovation, but the governance, the political one as well, of how we structure companies and organizations, if I understood correctly.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How do we survive as democracies when you can invent facts from whole cloth in an automated way? Like how do our democratic institutions survive that experience?
I feel like that's actually a quite nice place to start rounding it off. I feel like we've got quite broad there. I just I like starting these conversations the same way I like rounding them off the same as well. I like asking for a book and a podcast recommendation, mostly because these travel a lot through word of mouth, and I think they're an interesting way to know more about people in a bit of a different way. So it doesn't have to be about anything that we talked about. Dan, last time, I think you mentioned 4,000 Weeks, which like nothing to do with what we talked about, for example, which one of my favorite books, by the way. I don't know if I had read it then, but I really liked it. So these recommendations are really cool. That's why I asked for them. So yeah, if we can have one book and then one podcast, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can. I don't think I have a podcast other than Mind Behind Maps. Like that's a big
I'll
one.
take that.
Yeah, but
Let's go
I
for
have
a
a
book.
book and an audio book, I guess, that I could
sure.
recommend. So, from a book side, this is on the work side of things. There's a book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. This was recommended to me by Pablo Fuentes from MakePath. And it's great, and it talks about kind of the difference between bad bets and just bets that were good bets but didn't hit, and being able to make a distinction between those, and basically making how to think about making good bets even if they don't always win. That was really great. And then on the audiobook side, I'm not usually a huge audiobook fan because I like making notes and jotting in the margins or adding Kindle notes. But the book Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, fiction. But the audiobook version of that, I think, just trounces the written version, because I don't want to spoil anything. Audio is such an important component to that book. And to the nature of the story that unfolds. And so actually the way it was done in the audiobook was fantastic. And I really appreciated that.
I can only recommend this. I think most of Andy Weir's books are better as audiobooks because they're written in the first person and usually as logs as well. So yeah, I can that's actually usually I think an audiobook is a bit of a cop out because it's just a book, but no, for this I'll accept it. It is better as an audiobook.
Yeah, I'm not a big audiobook fan. This one deserves to.
Yep.
This one needs to be an audiobook. It's so well done. Yeah.
Robert, anything comes to mind?
I am a huge fan of audiobooks. I consume hundreds and hundreds of them. Very early Audible subscriber. But I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I am going to route around your limit of one by highlighting authors rather than specific books per se. So I'll highlight one author that, interestingly, was introduced to me by a tweet from Paul Ramsey. And it is a 2 podcast series by a guy named Mike Duncan, who is a history writer. So he did a history podcast called The History of Rome. It's like History of Rome in 100 chapters. And then he did another one called Revolutions, in which he cycles through about 7 or 8 of the major revolutions from the British, American, and French forward to the Russian, ends with the Russian Revolution. Just like really entertaining, really interesting take on things, a fresh, like even if you have read about these things, a fresh take on them and so on. And then I would say the other author that I have had a great deal of inspiration from in recent years is Steven Pinker. I think it's like I like Dan, and like a lot of entrepreneurs, like an optimist at heart. But sometimes it's hard to be an optimist. the world seems to be relentlessly abrasive against optimism, but I do think it's pretty powerful notion. And so two of his recent works, Enlightenment Now, in which he lays out the case for reason, science, humanism, and the idea of progress. And then the one before that, The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he looks at human society and the evolution of violence and the degree to which that, in a long-term perspective, violence is declining. And it's often hard to see that when we look at the news every day. These have been balms for me.
Great. I'm not familiar with those, so I'll go check that out. I agree on the optimism. I think we need more of it. Thank you both for the conversation. This was great. This covered so much ground. It was a wonderful conversation. Thanks a lot for your both of your time.
Oh, thanks so much for the opportunity. This was awesome. I love talking to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Max. You ask insightful and thoughtful questions. I really appreciate it, the opportunity.